Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel on building the business case for biodiversity conservation. So I'm John Paul Judson, delighted to be moderating this session. Maybe before we get started, a couple of points of principles that hopefully will help to set the context of this discussion. First one is that access to germplasm is key. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone in the audience here. It's key for breeding and for improving new varieties. Second thing is that the conservation of genetic resources is a matter of public interest, indeed maybe even planetary interest. The third thing is that countries have sovereign rights over their genetic resources. And any commercial gain that is made out of these genetic resources should be compensated through a benefit sharing mechanism. Now, because countries have sovereign rights, it also means that there are some international frameworks that organizes the governance of access and benefit sharing. We can think of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol, which are rather at the level of biodiversity at large and cover a wide range of uses of genetic resources. And then we have the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which is focused more specifically then on the use of genetic resources for food and agriculture, as the name is indicated. And this will obviously be the natural focus of this discussion, but you have to understand that these international frameworks somehow influence themselves, and you can't always isolate one from the other. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I would also like to get you involved from the get-go in the discussion. Can you please take your phones out, and I can ask maybe on the technical side if we can show the Mentimeter code so that people can connect to Mentimeter, if we can put up the Mentimeter on the screen. The idea is that you can either connect with a QR code. If you don't want to be tracked and traced to the bone, you can also go to menti.com and add in a code. So I think we should be able to put that up on the screens if possible. And in the meantime, maybe I can introduce our panelists nevertheless. So we have the honor, I will introduce you straight afterwards. So first I would like everyone to connect either with the QR code, or you can go to menti.com and use the code 51678577. Okay, can I get a loud cheer when you've connected? Yeah, yeah, okay. Everyone's connected? Are we good? Good to go? Okay, 3, 2, 1. Let's check out the first question, and I would like you to answer whether or not you agree or disagree with the following statements. The mechanisms of access and benefit sharing are too complex for seed companies. Access and benefit sharing requirements make it less interesting for a seed company to access germplasm. Seed companies do not have the necessary resources to manage access and benefit sharing requirements. So, complexity, access, resources. And while you're answering that, and we can keep the slide up, I will then introduce our panelists. So we have the honor of being joined by Kent Nnadozie. He's the Secretary of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources at the FAO. Welcome, Kent. Ajay Panchbai is Seed Systems Product Management Lead for Africa at CGIAR. Welcome, Ajay. And Yasmina Muminovic, she is Chair of the Genetic Resources Coordination Group at ISF and also Head of Genetic Resources at Bayer. Welcome, Yasmina. So I'm checking out some of the answers here. Now, Kent, I'd like you to maybe give a first reaction to what we see. What I can see is that complexity is perceived as pretty high. Access medium, but it's not particularly made interesting. And resources are a little bit high as well. But particularly complexity seems to be very, very high. I mean, do you agree that this is a fair assessment that the system is pretty complex?
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, colleagues. I think it's quite telling that there's that high perception, and I have to emphasize the word perception, that it is very complex. No doubt there are some complexity in the system, but when you look at the way the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources was designed, it was supposed to address some of the complexities of bilateral negotiations, take care of, that have one single pool of genetic resources, have one standardized agreement that that companies or anybody can use. But perhaps what that perception conceals a different kinds of issues that companies or users in the system are contending with, which would include like overlapping, mechanisms like you mentioned, the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Nagoya Protocol, or some of the uncertainties. Okay, I think that's better. The uncertainties that companies have to deal with. And it could also refer to some of the misalignments of expectations of some of the stakeholders, including the what the companies expect and what the countries or governments expect. So when there's that certain misalignment, I think that creates a little bit of asymmetry that could lead to the perception that is quite complex, and also lack of unfamiliarity. Unfamiliarity itself could also be one of the definitions of complexity.
So there are overlapping international frameworks and equally also different expectations on that framework functioning. But complexity is really high. I mean, do you recognize that in the sector, that it is a very complex system to work with?
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I think this poll reflects pretty well the reality that we are facing, because access and benefit sharing is complex at many different levels of complexity. So there is legislative complexity, because like you said, it's national legislation, that's multilateral forms of regulating access and benefit sharing through the treaty or through this new system of the CBD. There is also the scope complexity, because some of the systems would cover just genetic resources, some would cover just the sequencing information, what we call DSI, digital sequence information. Some would cover both. So finding your way through that, tunnel of things is not an easy task. And of course, it's operationally also very complex. One thing is, of course, how you track and trace. The other thing is how much you have to pay and where you have to pay. So this increasing operational cost, increasing compliance cost. Yeah, that's all, the levels of complexity that we're dealing with. And finally, but maybe the most important one, is the complexity when you work with genetic resources. It's actually a very risky game, because there is no guarantee that you will get a hit. So the value question, so what are you actually engaging with when you start using genetic resources, is another complex issue that we scientists like to deal with, but it's not necessarily an easy one to understand and manage. So yeah, it's very diversely complex.
Do you also recognize this complexity of the system?
Well, yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Jean-Paul, and thank you, ISF, for inviting CGIAR on this panel. Yeah, so like Kent mentioned, like Yasmina mentioned, I think there's some level of complexity, and that is rightly also being reflected in the poll. But I think, I'm of the opinion that it's really important to also understand the mix of the companies, right? So when we say seed industry, it's not just like one particular set of companies which are like well-established company. It's like good mix, right, from startup companies, SMBs, and so on and so forth, right? So it's really important to understand, maybe take one step down and to go to those details and what are the challenges, what makes them not so much easy for them to understand, right? And then I believe the importance of this kind of conference or this kind of panel, and also maybe some of the capacity building efforts that we may want to really develop together, would really address some of the challenges that they are really reflecting to. But it would be really interesting to understand, what are those key points or what are those bottlenecks that they see as the challenges to understand the system.
Yeah, because we see from the poll that it's not so attractive to access germplasm because of these requirements, and the resources need to be there, and there's a complexity of the companies as well that would be trying to access this material. You mentioned the different expectations as well. So is this what is creating a gap in this governance system, because countries have expectations that are very different to the industry? But I would like you to maybe go a step further and comment on whether you feel that the industry itself is a bit maybe dragging its feet on this system.
There's no doubt that there are gaps in expectations, between what the industry expects based on how they operate and the realities and the dynamics of the operating environment for industry. There's also different levels of expectations from government or from other stakeholders who have a different perception of how the industry works. So that gap in expectations could also be as a matter of both communication and information and awareness that could lead to that. But I think the industry's engagement is essential in this regard, and I frankly believe that they have not, at least as individual entities, have not engaged as actively as they could in the process, given the importance of the issues and the possible impacts on their business and their bottom line in the end. As ISF, for sure, I mean, as a federation and as a collective, they've been engaging in the process. But then, of course, at the end of the day, it's individual companies that take action, that it affected, engage in it. And I don't think they have engaged at that level yet. And that's our hope that, with the continuous discussions and engagement and dialogue, we could really get them on board to get them to fully engage. And more importantly, understand the system so that they can know for sure what it is all about, how it functions, or what its shortcomings are, and what their main concerns are, so they could also be addressed by the the implementers of the system in itself.
I mean, do you think that's a fair assessment, that the industry hasn't been sufficiently involved, Yasmina? I mean, is it fair to say that it's a relatively expert issue within the industry rather than a widespread understanding within the industry, and maybe that can explain some lack of involvement? But maybe you want to address the involvement as such question. Maybe you don't agree with that.
How can I not agree with Kent? Is there a way? Yeah, I do agree, and we also do see that we can engage more, we can be maybe like more proactive. However, it is very technically complex issue. Like I said, 3D is just one of the elements in the mix that we in the seed sector are dealing with, and as the technology is advancing, we are not afraid. We're happy to be more challenged with additional added elements to that complex mix already. Yes, indeed, industry, like I said, it is a complex, operationally, technically charged issue, but it's also very political, very emotional conversation. It's also a conversation where we still need to work a lot on building trust across different stakeholder groups. But when it comes to the gap, and is industry, like you said, just dragging its feet on it, or are we really using the system? Are we not using the system? Have we done what we were expected to be done? We're continuously working on getting much better understanding. How are we actually using the system now? Is the value that the system potentially contains actually leveraged by the industry to the sufficient level, or can we do more about it? But it's also interesting to note that it's not just, one thing that we deal with. So in the improvement process of the treaty, so we deal with different elements at the same time. So how do we access and how much do we pay? what are the crops, what is the diversity of crops that are actually within the scope of that system. What do we then do with this digital sequencing information? How do we integrate it into the 3D or not? So all these are intertwined and connected and very dependent on each other. So we cannot resolve one without resolving the other two. But again, like resolving all three of them at the same time takes an extensive effort. As industry, yes, yeah, there is engagement, and again, it's a very technical topic. So yeah, it is expert discussions. That's why mostly ISF, but also our regional seed associations and many national seed associations have direct conversations with their governments to understand better, to also raise awareness across the sector on what is happening and what we can do to address it even better.
Because there's obviously this political, emotional context, geopolitical maybe, and on the other hand, there is a material that can have a value. Ajay, I mean, you're also working with accessing that material. Can you say something about this political complexity versus the actual value of the material when you're able to access it and put it into practice?
Sure. Okay. So let me take one example, right? So CGIAR has been engaging with private sector for a very long time, right? And one of the very popular mechanism is to really engage with private sector through consortia. And let me take this example from ERI. We have one of the oldest consortium within CG system, and it's called HRDC, Hybrid Race Development Consortium. And going back to what I said earlier, that when we look at the kind of like, diversity and to an extent complexity also coming from the members. So this is the consortium which is completely designed and driven by the member companies. So when you look at the bandwidth, you have all established companies and MNCs and so on, which are not so much interested into the final product, but then which are interested into getting parental lines and so on. Whereas the other extreme of the bandwidth, which is the new companies, startup companies and SMEs, they are more interested into the getting final product. Right now, while understanding this whole mechanism of access and benefit sharing may not be so much difficult for this side, which is well established, but it is a complex issue for the startup companies or SMEs and all that. So from that perspective, I truly believe, and coming back to your point about the geopolitical complexities, so the the models and the business models, or the arrangement that we see from CG perspective, which are very efficiently working in one parts, like for example in Asia, not necessarily will work equally well in other parts. Like for example, take an example of Africa. So whenever we are designing something which is working in Asia, to customize that for Africa, we always take that into consideration, because the kind of like membership that you have in Asia, so the companies coming from Africa may see that as the entry barrier. So there are complexities at various level, technical level, but at the same time at the geopolitical level as well. And when we are designing something which we think should really work equally well, then we will have to really take into consideration those local context and local geopolitical differences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it does seem difficult to make a system attractive when it is complex, right? I mean, to be fair. And also on the industry involvement, do you also look beyond? I mean, obviously, we're talking here a lot about the seed industry, which is obviously the most connected to accessing germplasm. But do you also have a reflection on benefit sharing in a broader sense, in terms of food production more generally, and further actors in the value chain that will also be benefiting from improved varieties all the way down the food production chain? Is that also in the concept of benefit sharing potentially?
Indeed, of course, especially with the food, especially with the food processing industry, which benefits and extracts with significant value in the entire value chain. But the problem is that because genetic resources are sometimes invisible, even with the seed sector, while it is very, very essential. The tendency is that because it's the work that is related to genetic resources really, really upstream, and then the downstream activities, are not.
Sorry. Please continue. Behind you, over there. Please continue.
Okay. All right. Okay. I thought it was my microphone that was
No
a problem. If you can hear me, okay. Yes, indeed. So certainly it is extremely important to have all the players in the value chain to contribute to the benefit, because they ultimately benefit from it. I mean, using a metaphor of a river, you have the wellspring, where the river comes from. it may be somewhere in the remote mountain with forest over there, it flows down in a very long river where, some along the line, some people extract water for farming, others put dams for electricity, others use it for other things. So the people there tend to forget what is happening upstream, where the river is actually coming from. And then people put up obstacles and rivers and pollute and create diversions in that regard. So all the people downstream ought to really be interested in what is happening upstream at the start, at the wellspring. So should there be some major disaster over there, everybody loses, which is why if the river stops flowing, we all lose in the end. Something with genetic resources. There are places, it starts from somewhere. The material that even current breeders rely on are the result of generations of input from other breeders, from other farmers that have started all along over time. So that should be recognized, and everybody in the entire value chain should be able to contribute. And in that. So at the end of the day, if you invest in it, it's really very strategic foresight to do so.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much that conversation on the value of genetic resources is happening in other parts of the value chain. I mean, probably very strong here, even if maybe not strong enough, but probably less strong as we go down the river. There's a few known faces in the audience because I have worked in this sector some years ago. There's one particularly known face who's chosen the pillar, and I would like Neil Slowers maybe to give us some, I don't know, first few thoughts on this conversation so far.
Well, maybe I'm here with my back to the pillar.
You can't go any
It's
further.
the kind of safest place that is there in this hall. I was asked to be a reactor. I will not be an atomic reactor, but I've formulated two questions, one for Yasmina. These few experts that know all this complexity, you included, and my former colleague Anke as well, have we been able to explain the issues well enough to the strategic level of the companies so that we can have, as a seed industry, a more strategic out-of-the-box discussion? Did we do a good job within our companies, is my question.
And actually, that was because there was a comment on one of the LinkedIn posts in the run-up to this panel from someone saying, what about the investors? Are they interested in these kinds of issues? Do they value these kinds of issues in the work being done in companies here?
That's a great question, because that's actually the connection with breeding, on the ground work with that strategic level of investment of, environmental, social responsibility even, because we speak about use of genetic resources and how we fund biodiversity conservation. So these are like a smaller scope and a much wider scope of maybe the same journey of the same thing. So biodiversity conservation is a huge international undertaking at global level. Benefit sharing on the use of genetic resources is a component that will contribute to that biodiversity conservation. It will not solve it, because we actually talk about much bigger amounts of money and much bigger footprint or impact of different players in that whole biodiversity conservation space. So there is role for everybody there. So yeah, for value chain, for other actors in the system, for governments, for NGOs, for civil society. So everybody has a say, is concerned, and should play a role in biodiversity conservation. To Neil's, the point of Neil, so whether we have done a good job, I think we are learning over time. So yeah, we have done some of the work, and it's always one step at a time. So sometimes you do, like, you can reach only so far, and you can get only so much understanding. But then as the story evolves and the complexity builds, we need to always, invest a little more work. I don't think that we have done our homework entirely well. We can still do more, and we are on track to do more. Again, not because it's the use of genetic resources by the breeders, but because it's this bigger scope of biodiversity conservation that is now becoming, let's say, more visible and more impactful in these conversations.
No, I was particularly also pointing at the benefit sharing point. Of course, when you come to management and say there's a risk that you have to pay, the natural reaction is try to avoid it. Whereas in my point, and that coming to Kent also, aren't we stuck also ourselves in this complexity? That is there room for real new thinking about what were the objectives that we started with 40 years ago. What have we developed in all the political complexities? And can we go back and come up with something that is less complex, that brings in the money? And for example, if companies don't want to pay, because if their competitor doesn't pay for some reason, they have a competitive disadvantage. So if there is also from a strategic level, from the company point of view, if we all pay in the same way, there is no distortion of the market. But are we stuck in the now with DSI, with the questions that are there in your next governing body meeting? They only respond to the problems that have evolved politically over the last 30 years. Okay, for the treaty, only 20.
Yes.
How can we create space for out-of-the-box thinking, or is that wishful thinking?
Absolutely not. It's not wishful thinking. The way what I can say, which is that let's not use the complexity of the system or the design of the system as an excuse for inaction. I mean, the companies have and are continuously dealing with complexity, both in the environment, in the technologies that they use, in the market. So they're used to dealing with complexity and have found innovative ways of resolving complex situations and making, doing their business and making progress, and advancing within the science required to. So I don't think it's a matter of applying the same innovative spirit and tendency to the situation that we have. I guess maybe they're a bit reluctant because of it is political, as Yasmina mentioned. So there's a tendency to be overly sensitive and super sensitive about that fact. But I don't think they should be, because invariably, as I said at the opening ceremony, which is a common saying, that if you're not at the table, you might end up becoming part of the menu. So other people make the rules that govern your operating environment, and then you're not part of making that the decisions and making inputs into that. So I don't think that we have reached a situation where there's no opening for innovation and for new designs of the system. I think the negotiations that are going on currently, which the industry through the ISF is fully engaged and making inputs into that. And I wish they had been a lot more engaged, or previously more engaged as engaged as they are now as previously, right from the start. That would have been, that certainly made a lot of difference. And to begin with, it would also give the opportunity for the industry to sensitize the other, stakeholders and the state parties and member states of how the industry actually operates and functions, so that there's no speculation, there's no sky high expectations, or things that are make decisions based on uninformed perceptions, so to speak. So I think there's need, and there's also room for that innovation, and that you apply to other aspects of your operations to this kind of situation.
Although, to be fair, as a breeder, you probably do actually prefer to be on the menu.
Yeah, okay.
In the end, if your varieties were successful.
Yes.
Yes, please, Yasmina.
Yeah, I wanted to put myself in a bad place of not agreeing with Niels after I agreed with Kent. I wouldn't say that companies are not willing to pay. When it comes to access to genetic resources and use of genetic resources, I think it's just like putting us in a very bad space, saying, yeah, we're doing so much, but we are not willing to pay. It's not about willing or not being willing. I mean, companies pay daily, monthly, annually, so many royalties and license fees and, different, whatever bills need to be paid to run your operations well. So it's not about, we just not will, there is no will to do that. That's why we're here today. How do we make use of genetic resources a business case? So what are we paying for? What is the value that we are getting? And what is the value that we can produce with what we are accessing in the genetic resources? Because that's another, again, going back maybe to an earlier point in conversation. So how often are actually plant breeders using, the genetic material from the treaty? How much value has been extracted from it, and what has been made commercial? when we have that story more, clearly understandable in that shape and form, then it will be also, easy to understand the payment. So that there has been no payment because maybe there was not like excessive use in that commercial track that would demand, a mandatory payment back into the system.
Please, you want to add?
Sure. I mean, just to reflect and just to maybe share CGIR's perspective, right? So if you look at CGIR in maybe decades ago and CGIR today, so more and more we are into kind of like this developing innovations and so on. Now we are so much purposeful also to make sure that how do we make sure that this CG innovation or maybe national partners innovation make it to the last miles, and that's where the importance of this all the partnership and basically high value partners and partnership, including private sector, comes into play. And CGIR, like I said, maybe in the last couple of years, has been very, very purposeful in nurturing those partnerships and making sure that we basically deliver CG innovation to the last mile. Now, in that mix, if we could really very objectively think about the partnership which is working and which is kind of like win-win situation, including the access and benefit sharing, that would be kind of like great value addition to CG innovation to go to the reach to the last miles.
Yeah. No, yeah, please.
Yes, indeed. I think one other point I wanted to also address was Neil's statement about having a level playing field. Certainly, that's something that needs to be conveyed to the negotiators. That some of the concern they have in the sector is ensuring that there is level playing field and some people do not cheat or are freeloaders in the system. It is a common understanding within the industry that conserving the genetic resources is not an externality in your business operations, and it's widely understood, and everybody's ready and willing to contribute their own piece towards that. Then I think that's a starting point for leveling the field, and understanding that action is not necessarily as somebody said yesterday, it's not charity, but really a strategic decision, even from a perspective of risk management. Because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, what you would need. So if there's that common understanding within the sector, and then you can come with that, position as a starting point, then the rules that will be put in place can now design it in such a way that it is also equally fair. And then the fairness also goes towards, being able to and willing to contribute and pay, a fair amount for the use and for the benefits derived from the use of the genetic resources from the system.
I'd like also to put this conversation in the context of the market dynamics also that have probably changed a lot in the 20 years of existence of the treaty. And when we look at seeds, I mean, we're talking highly complex technological products where there's increasingly more and more technology involved, right? I'm also wondering how much the value of genetic resources as such is being considered when you look at the value being generated by all the breeding technology that is applied to it, and sometimes indeed applied to more like the digital sequence information or what have you. Is one of the issues within companies to say, well, this benefit sharing honestly doesn't make a lot of sense because the value is not really coming from the genetic resources so much anymore. It's coming from the power of our knowledge that has increased a lot, especially in the last 20 years. I mean, I think it's quite exponential. Isn't that a bit of a big divide that needs to somehow be addressed from the discussion of 20 years ago to the one that's happening today? Yasmina, maybe?
Yeah, the answer is yes and no. So, because innovation, especially in our sector, in plant breeding, will always be linked with access to new genetic variation. So we will always be selling seed because, we will always need food, right? So that's very tangible element in the work that we do. How do we get to better products? It is indeed by using better technology, but that technology enables us to understand better what is in our seed, what is in our material. It's more, the how of getting to having a final product, whereas the final product still is a very tangible physical component, which is seed. And we see this issue and struggle very often to explain when we are engaged in this digital sequencing information conversation. So it's really hard to extrapolate in seed business. This is the value that genetic information, or like knowing about, our genomes and our, traits and how, the whole inheritance, process works. That's the value that's been derived, by using information, and the other thing is the value that's derived by using our physical material. This is practically the same thing. It's like, I often say it's like reading a book. So you just have to know what's inside in order to move more quickly, in a more precise, more accurate way, to get to the final product. So it's pretty much the same thing. So the what and the how. So yes, technology helps us, but it would be probably not realistic to expect, and because of the use of the technology, we will very soon completely give up working with physical material and be selling data, selling information, and feeding on information, and sequencing information. So ultimately, it will always have to be physical seed.
Okay, yeah, but do you see that still that will be something to be addressed, because ultimately the funding is always linked to this benefit sharing and this notion that you're making commercial gain, but that commercial gain is probably less and less linked to accessing this germplasm that we're talking about, right? As we go along.
Indeed, of course, in the entire value chain, it's very difficult to really, calculate what value is added or extracted at each stage. It's sometimes difficult to really distinguish the origin of innovation and its expression. Of course, genetic resources is the foundation of the innovation, the starting point. Over the time in the chain, of course, it grows exponentially. Other technologies, other ideas, other knowledge and expertise are added to it to make it even more valuable. So there's it's of course become much more complex to really calculate that value. But at the same time, the understanding that, look, the source of the ultimate innovation still lies within the germplasm that it started with, and it will always end up in it as well. So the question is, how do you make sure that there's a fair compensation, or would I say compensation or contribution and a payment for that benefit that and the value that is extracted in the process.
Okay, is Jaspreet Stam from Crop Trust in the room somewhere? No, you
Joanna,
please, if we can hear from you.
yes.
And can you please stand up?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And this is a question with a bit of a preamble for the group. Thank you so much for the insight so far. My name is Joanna Purcell. I come from the Global Crop Diversity Trust, with connections in the panel. We were established under the International Plant Treaty, so we are part of the official funding strategy of the treaty through our endowment fund. And our endowment fund then goes to being part of supporting the CG system, particularly our success story of IRI. And our goal is to have perpetual, forever funding for these important gene banks around the world. So that's a little bit about what we do in Crop Trust. And we watch the access and benefit sharing dialogue and debates from the outside with great interest. It's my first Seed Congress, so I have to say I was warmed by the sense of community, the sense of collaboration, the can-do attitudes, and that is something I really would like to underline. I haven't spoken to anybody who has said, we don't support the importance of crop conservation. Nobody has said that this isn't important, of course. Maybe they have said a little bit about the complexity, and I think this is for us in Crop Trust, I think this might be the concerning piece, because it feels like an opportunity lost. And that opportunity is, what can we do at the same time as having these negotiations? I've met some people. I'm coming from a partnerships background, by the way, so I would call myself a generalist. And what I really like to hear is storytelling, the importance of including people at the table. And so there's two considerations that I have that I want to share with the panel and get their opinions on. One is from the seed sector perspective. So I see a huge community, people who've known each other for generations. In fact, I see the importance of family business here too. How do we bring in the wider ecosystem, the wider private sector ecosystem? We talked about value chains. What is the seed sector leverage with the wider value chain? And equally, how do we storytell together? I'm let's say, much more comfortable in the multilateral space. We heard earlier today a push to have the seed sector at platforms like the United Nations COP30 in Brazil later this year. We heard in our road to COP that the seed sector should have a louder voice. And I think the articulation and the passion and the buy-in that I've heard in the few days I've been here is powerful, and I actually want to contribute to amplifying that too. So my question also is to AJ and Kent: how do we bring in the multilateral sector, the crowds that we run in, and have them connect more with the seed sector? And what is the opportunities we're losing? The opportunities for innovation, for storytelling? Because once again, I think I have a lot of homework to do after being here for these few days. We really need funding for conservation, use, and access. That's top of mind for me. So, and this is an important debate, but how do we keep moving? And so if I were to follow Kent's metaphors, I would say, how do we walk and chew gum at the same time? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, two things that I get. So, leveraging this value chain. I mean, does the seed sector have the capacity to leverage other players in this field? And what room is there? I mean, to some extent, it comes back also to what Niels was saying. You know, what room is there to think creatively about the fundamental objective, which is also then to conserve genetic resources? What room is there to do that, potentially actually outside of these more complex treaties that ultimately link that to this benefit sharing mechanism, which becomes increasingly complex because it's linked back to countries' sovereign rights? That makes it very difficult. So can we be creative about that? Let's start with you, and then leveraging a bit more the value chains would also be interesting to hear from you.
Surely, I mean, there's certainly room for the involvement of everybody. I think that's one of the reasons why the Plan Treaty was negotiated and agreed upon, to provide that platform where the different stakeholders, different interests come together to find joint solutions to common problems. And one of those common problems that is, actually, I would say existential, is the loss of diversity and the threat to food security. And that's something that's, of interest at both at the political, social, but also at the business level. So the treaty provides that platform for engagement and for discussion, and that they all come together to deal with that issue. So that's why I keep saying that when you invest in this, in conserving genetic resources, it is not charity as such. It's something that, unlike an insurance policy, really a strategic decision that even though maybe to your own particular business you're concerned with, we may not see the immediate direct line of sight to that point, but invariably it affects what you do in the long run. And I don't think the business should be reticent in engaging because they think it's too political or too. Don't forget, you operate and function in a political context. The decisions currently that have been taken about tariffs or no tariffs, I'm sure you all felt the impact. Those are political decisions that impact your activities and your operating environment. The same thing that if we do not take decisions that really create rules that ensure that the diversity that we're going to need now and in the future are conserved for whatever eventually that's going to happen, invariably you're going to find a situation where we also face such problems, down the line.
Okay, so an ardent defender that the treaty is the platform. I would expect nothing less, Kent. That's fair enough. Also, a question on the value chain. I mean, before we say whether the seed sector has any leverage or not, do you even think it's a good idea to get more value chain players involved in this system?
In the system of biodiversity conservation, yes. In the system of users of DSI, no, because it's horribly complicated to explain it to ourselves what it is, what it means, and what is it about. I think that the whole thing really is about the narrative and what is our fundamental starting point and fundamental objective. So if we really talk about biodiversity conservation for agricultural crops, there is definitely room to expand the conversation, expand, the players and payers into that fund across the value chain. However, it's also complex. The value chains are also complex, depending on, I guess, the crop, market, geography. I'm not an expert in that field, but from what I hear, it's not just an easy task. It's not like knock 3 doors and you have everybody involved. So it's a very complex conversation already at our plant breeding or seed breeding or seed companies level. Like Neil said, yeah, we are still getting there to explaining, to our CEOs and to our strategic strategy makers within companies, within the industry on, what benefit sharing is about. I think it's very valuable to reconsider the starting and the ending point. If it's biodiversity conservation of agricultural crops, if we're talking about, something that we need to have and will definitely use going forward, and we all depend on it and we all benefit from it. So that's definitely, the narrative or, a little, changed objective or milestone, whatever the decision, whatever we want to call it, that we should use to involve wider group of stakeholders and involve them in this important conversation. But again, if we keep it at this technical, very complex level, and if we dig deeper down into what DSI is and what artificial intelligence will do going forward, we will just not get there of having anybody interested to listen and not engage in these conversations.
And also the lady talked about the gene banks, right? Who are in the end the ones who are keeping the genetic resources that we're talking about. They also have a role to play. In what state are they in today? I mean, are they reliable partners when we're talking about, the kind of breeding programs that create the value that then generates the benefit sharing? Do we have here sort of professional partners, reactive partners, business partners, or is there a lot of work to be done also on the gene bank level?
Absolutely. No, thank you. I think this is very, 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 valid question. And maybe going back to what, Joanna mentioned. So she also very aptly mentioned about the partnership, right? And maybe, so that reminds me of our conversation that we had this morning, Joanna, that while international gene banks, which are like primarily kind of like driven by CG centers, right? It's also equally important to really have those very objective linkages with the national gene banks. And last week I was in this Kigali meeting, which was organized by African Seed and Biotechnology Program under the African Union Commission. And so this convener from African Union Commission shared with the group that the new leadership of African Union, they would like to see 5 new gene banks. And that's what we were discussing, that it is, while it is really important to maintain and manage the existing platform or existing linkages of the international gene banks, whatever we want to do as an additional thing, I think it's very, very critical to also leverage from the existing network. While African Union may have this aspiration to really start 5 new gene banks, where and how can we leverage from the national gene banks and the international gene banks, which are so efficiently working? I think that would be the kind of like conversation that we would like to really have with Crop Trust and also with Treaty. And maybe, very quick reflection on the value chain, whether the value chain should be leveraged or should be tightly linked to the seed chain. Maybe in the African context, yes, absolutely. Because we have seen many initiatives in Africa, which are still, right, the project dependent, which means that there's a project support, the initiative is at this level. When the project support goes down, the entire initiative goes down. And when we spoke to many, for example, farmers, right, so then they said, where's the market? Now we have to really create this ecosystem in a way that there's a co-investment coming from the value chain, as much as we are dependent upon the funding coming from the national system and also from the international donors. But unless and until there's a co-investment coming from the value chain, this whole ecosystem will not be self-sustaining. I was like, we still will be talking about, there's a project and there's a funding, and then once the funding goes down, project goes down. So value chain will have to really co-invest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have some youth ambassadors in the room who'd like to maybe chip in, throw a comment or a question? Yes, please, can we? And if you could stand up if possible, thank you.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Jose Cervantes. I'm from Costa Rica, and I'm an aging ambassador. And yeah, I have like a very different perspective. We have spoken from a very broader or global point of view, but I would like to know your perspective on the local level. For example, in Latin America, women are recognized as the main guardians of biodiversity, and especially of seeds. And for many years, the cultural heritage in agriculture has been maintained by these guardians. There is a talk of certain approaches and goals of MLS for the preservation of biodiversity. But how does this integrate with the agenda that is carried out into the communities by these guardians? I would like to know what are the methodologies, the approaches, or the lines of actions for the seed companies or the cooperation organizations to work from the territories and create this holistic integration system.
So would that be what you're saying is that it's not just through gene banks that genetic resources are preserved? There are other ways of doing that in certain communities, and you're highlighting what happens in Costa Rica particularly.
Exactly.
Okay.
I would like to know how this is going to be seen in my community, for example.
Okay. Who would like to have a reaction on that? Kent? Yeah, please.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I think the youth brings really good perspective to the discussions, because for them they're a lot more concerned about the future, and most of the work that we do is also about the future. How do we ensure in the future that we do not have problems, or we're able to or we're in a position to address any future challenges and eventualities or things unknowns that can happen at that time. But at the same time, how do we look at the past and those who have contributed and generated and also stewarded the diversity in local communities, especially women? How do they take them into account in this? I would say in the landscape. So the treaty recognizes these, I would say, spectrum of players and different levels of contribution in terms of both conservation and also use. The local communities, the farmers in the field, have also innovations and have been custodians of diversity at their level. They also have different needs and different expectations. So they should be part of the system in such a way that the diversity that they use, they get support for that, and they ensure that, of course, they continue to produce and make a decent living for those who are engaged in direct agriculture. Also, they engage the youth as well, because they are the ones that would, in succession, their future is at stake in this regard. So that is something that's very critical. And the treaty system, through its benefit sharing fund, has essentially focused on supporting the local farmers at that level. The limited resources we've been able to generate from the system is applied directly and made huge impact at that level, supporting them to develop local systems, but also link them up to the research institutions or the market, as well as the link to the commercial sector.
Yeah, because obviously there's a method in conservation that will be more or less an incentive for companies to work with those methods, I assume. And these conversations are happening at the same tables as these access and benefit sharing conversations. Are these discussions that as a seed sector you're capable to contribute to as seed companies? Are you relevant to these kinds of discussions on how to conserve genetic resources?
I think we're absolutely relevant, and there is, in addition to contributing to a benefit sharing fund, hopefully in an increased way going forward when we fix the elements that we are working on in the system. There is a great, not often mentioned element of non-monetary benefit sharing, of a contribution that companies actually do on the ground, very often with genetic resources, or actually gene banks. And maybe also to add to Ajay's point, the state of gene banks across the world is very diverse. So very often you, as a user, you would reach out to a gene bank and either not get a response after you request it, or you get a response, oh, material is not available, we need to do another round of increase, and then you will get it. Or you just get 5 seeds that you have to increase, so that means next year you will have to start your research. So there is a lot of work that many companies in our sector do to directly support the management of collections in the gene banks. But let's be fair. We do it for the crops that we also breed for. So we cannot maintain the gene bank of a collection that we don't have in our portfolio. We don't know how to, increase that seed. We don't have the model that would, adapt so easily to crops other than those that we would commonly use. So there will be, I'm sure, issues across the globe. But then there is also a lot of work happening on the ground with different communities, with smallholders, with including women and youth and different stakeholders on the ground, where companies share the know-how, they share the technology, they participate in the capacity development, like simply by building schools or training young students in their desire to learn more about the seed sector. So there is still a lot to do, and we can obviously always do more, but yeah, we are aware and we engage. However, this non-monetary benefit sharing is kind of left out of being valued or recognized, to the level that it actually deserves.
Okay, brilliant. Any other? Yep, please.
Hi, I'm Swati. I'm from IRI, International Rice Research Institute. I don't want to add another layer of complexity to already a complex subject of ABS, but then my question to the experts are that, when we talk about emerging areas like gene editing, so we all understand ABS comes to picture when there is physical exchange of like physical access of germplasms and etc. But often the debate goes that when we go for gene editing and use DSI, and that is based on primarily on publicly sourced database at global level or at national level and etc. So somewhere it is also connected to traditional knowledge derived from that and etc. So are we thinking about something, some layers around that, that how the ABS also looked into that space, like having access to those public database and etc., especially from global south? Yeah.
Okay, so that's also linked to like even gene editing technology, like in general, the heritage to some extent, the impact of heritage on technology.
I can take it up very quickly. I hope that's the direction that you are going with your question. Well, this new multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing on the use of DSI from publicly available databases is exactly the scope of the CBD, of the conventional biological diversity scope. It has its issues, obviously, and it's still the element, the mechanism that has just been launched or agreed on, but not yet, fully developed, because there are elements that we are still working across stakeholder groups again on making it viable. But yeah, one of the issues is exactly the scope. So it's publicly available DSI, which comes from countries that don't have regulation on DSI. Now we are expecting, users to pay for the use of something that has originally not required any payment, something that we have maybe also partially helped develop, because through different partnerships or through our own research, we have created a lot of sequencing information that ended up in that publicly shared space. So it's another level of complexity. You are right, but yeah, it is definitely being considered in the international negotiations, not directly and necessarily under the treaty level, but yes, at the CBD level. And I wanted to say there was another question from Andy. I don't know if we want to take it.
Please.
Andy Levine with the American Seed Trade Association. Quick question, just to follow up with my friend Niels Lauwers. Question is, are we at the point where we need to reset the stage on this issue? Kent, it's been, we were talking with Dr. Fowler last night, 1979 is when he started this discussion. And the landscape has shifted so much. We have been to the altar 2 or 3 times since I've been with ASTA, and we did not get a result and were turned away. So the industry is very ready to work to find a solution to this issue. But I think the landscape has changed so dramatically and the corners have gotten so far away, would be much better to build a new foundation and come back to the middle. So I'm wondering if that's an option today, or do we continue just to stand in our corners and argue?
So we've come back to this point. I always have to turn to you, Kent. I mean, he has been an ardent defendant that the treaty is the platform.
Well, that's on page 4.
Can you give us a final plea or an agreement with the idea of we need some kind of a system change here? Go for it.
There's no doubt that the landscape has changed, dramatically, and it continues to change. But also there's some risk in, trying to really reset the system in that manner. It could also kickstart a new process of negotiations, and then that take long before you come to an agreement. The conditions have already changed by then. So how do we balance sustaining and maintaining the system that we have in such a way, or adapting it to new conditions, and at the same time making new inputs and new ideas to make it much more user focused, I would say. So that's where the difficulty comes from. But we're dealing with the political complexity, I think, is much more serious issue in this case, and then creating broad understanding and equal understanding of the issues, and taking into account the different expectations and different needs and positions of the different countries. So it certainly needs inputs to adapt and adjust, and that's what we're going through at the moment to make sure that the system adapts to the changes, new developments, whether it's in DSI, even though it's not according to some position that was not taken into account at the time the treaty was negotiated, but that's created certainly a new issue for discussion and debate that somehow needs to be addressed within the context of the current negotiations.
Okay, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know.
No.
So before you all leave, can I get you back onto the Menti? If you're still connected, I would just like to ask you a final question on a scale of 1 to 10. If we can move to the next one, how committed are you, having listened to this panel and heard the different issues, how committed are you to fund and support the access and benefit sharing system for plant genetic resources? Can you give us a sense of where we're at after having heard this panel?
We started with 10.
And maybe a quick last reaction on this kind of system change element, like literally 30 seconds. Do you believe in it, or do you think we really need to work with the system that we have, the treaty?
Well, I believe that we all want a solution. I believe that we all need a solution. I believe that we all need to be really pragmatic and very reasonable. Yeah, there are so many different expectations from, the users, the providers, all the stakeholders. I think agreeing on some kind of middle ground, meeting, halfway, understanding that we will not be able to resolve it in no time. It will really need time until we really get to that level of maximize benefit sharing and maximize funds for biodiversity conservation ultimately. But getting there, I think it's a process. It needs, steps and commitments and compromises from all the different stakeholder groups, but because we all want it to be future-proof, we all want it to be predictable, sustainable, to know like what are we paying for, and the providers, what are we getting the money for? So I guess there is a way, and hopefully we'll get there soon.
Okay, Ajay, final word on this system change aspect, or stick to the treaty?
So basically, when you look at today, about like 90% of the germplasm which is currently being shared under ABLS, that is being contributed by CGIAR, right? And then we firmly believe that conserving and then sharing material, sharing germplasm is so critical to address all the challenges that we are facing in our food systems, right? To ensure food security, to ensure really nutrition security, let us all come together, let us all kind of, join hands and look at it very objectively. We know it's very important. Look at it very objectively. And let us build this system which is more robust and more sustainable. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, brilliant. And to be fair, you achieved a relatively high level of commitment, Ken.
Indeed.
Well done. Thank you so much to our three panelists. Thanks for having attended. And I wish you a good continuation of the Congress. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.